All right, everyone see the presentation? Someone? I don't have a second monitor today, which is a little bit of a hindrance here. So yeah, feel free to just speak up if there's something people want to bring up or a question, because it's going to be a little difficult with just the single monitor. Unless there's like a speaker mode. Hold on one sec. Let me see if I can. No, it's not. Okay, well, we'll just do it this way, and I'll check messages periodically. All right, so my goals today are to talk about security, specifically Ubuntu security for setting up your validator, and then key security for your validator identity, vote account, and withdrawal keys. The reason I wanted to talk about this was there's been a couple people reaching out to me from the delegation program who have their identity keys compromised. And there was a recent hack in December at a data center where I'm not sure the total number, but around 8 or 9 validators had their identity key compromised. And I think all of those could have been avoided if people took these steps. So I want to talk a little bit about some ideas for what you might want to do for your validator to make sure that you at least cover some surfaces to make sure people don't have easy access to your machine, and then kind of open it up for discussion to see what other people are doing, and figure out if people have methods that they're using that I don't mention here, or methods they do or don't like, just so we can see what the community is doing. So my goals today, first of all, talk about what to do before you start running your validator. So these are not necessarily validator specific things. These are just Ubuntu server hardening practices, things that you can do for setting up either a validator, or if you're setting up like an Apache server or anything else, ways to limit access to the box. And then after that, talk a little bit about key security and an option that was brought up during that hack about starting your validator without actually having the identity key even physically on your machine. So that's maybe something people want to do, but there are some trade-offs there. Just going to check messages real quick. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, and again, if there's questions, please just speak up. Don't need to raise your hand or anything. We'll just make it interactive. Okay, so first and foremost, you should be using SSH keys for login and try to avoid password login. Recommendation here is to use an SSH key, generate an SSH key, or use one that you've already got. Copy it to your machine, so SSH copy ID, the path to the key, and then the server that you want to connect to. Then once you've done that, make sure that the password authentication to the server is disabled. So if you have a box that has password authentication to start, you want to go in and edit the SSH config, turn password authentication to no, and challenge response authentication to no as well. That way, even if someone tries to log in with a password instead of an SSH key, they'll be denied. The nice thing about this, of course, is that people can't try to brute force your password. It makes it a lot harder to gain access because only SSH keys are allowed, and they're obviously very difficult to guess. Another thing that you could consider, and I'm kind of curious if anyone is currently doing this, is setting up two-factor auth. So using Google Authenticator, you can actually set up two-factor auth to your machine. Is there anyone that's currently doing this or has this set up?
I do not, but I will inject. I have a very minor addition for my own login, and that is that I subscribe to the service, I think it's called TextBelt, where you can SMS message yourself. And I have a little line in my Bash login for the only user that can log in that sends me a text message anytime there's a login. I just wanted to be able, and so an attacker would have to sort of know that if they were somehow able to log in through my account, they would have to know ahead of time. I don't even know how they could prevent that line from running since it's in my bash login. But anyway, it just sends me an SMS message. It's not true security, but it's just one more step to let me know if something was to go wrong and someone were to somehow get in, I'll get a test message at a time that I wasn't expecting it saying that I had been logged into. So I have that one minor addition. It was pretty easy to add.
Yeah, that's a great addition. Yeah, I sort of glaze over some details here, but monitoring is always super useful as well as sort of limiting access, right? So it's always a good idea to have either email or text message alerts that tell you like when something suspicious is happening, like a login that you don't expect. So yeah, completely agree. That's awesome. If you want to share any of that setup or just message it out to the group, that would be helpful too. So anyway, two-factor auth. I haven't actually set this up myself. I don't know the limitations of it, if it becomes cumbersome for running a validator. My hunch is it's not, but something to investigate and try out. Okay, next recommendation here is to update regularly. As you all know, there's always security vulnerabilities in every software. They're impossible to avoid completely. The best mitigation, of course, is whenever there is a security vulnerability and it is patched and fixed, you should update right away. A good practice would be to follow security notices like Ubuntu security notices here. And then once you see that that security notice has been published, you should update and upgrade to the latest. Of course, this line here just does a general upgrade of all packages. That is probably not what you want for all cases. You probably just want to focus on the package that has security vulnerabilities. But this is good to do periodically as well, just to make sure you're not, you don't have some stale packages there that are years old and maybe exploitable. Another thing to do is just to regularly audit your list of installed packages. If you do sudo apt list installed, you can see all the packages that you've got installed, and maybe there's some stuff like I don't know, maybe you were experimenting with something, you installed something 6 months ago and you're not using it anymore. It might be a good time to remove that. So yeah, update regularly. And then another tool that I think is useful, I'm not sure if people are using this or not, is to actually install what's called unattended upgrades. This essentially does these steps for you automatically. So it looks for any changes in the list of, I can actually show you the list here. Oops. I think I've got it on this one. Oh, password. Well, I'll skip this for now. I don't want to grab the password at the moment. It essentially allows you to decide which packet repositories you're going to monitor. And if there's any changes to those repositories, then it upgrades those packages automatically. By default, it is just set to security upgrades and not to general updates. But you can configure all these things. I would suggest just setting this explicitly to false so that you don't automatically reboot your machine when there's an upgrade. I don't think it's very common for that to be necessary, but every once in a while there's some package that requires an upgrade, or sorry, requires a reboot of your system. You don't want that to happen at like 2 p.m. when you're maybe not around or not available, not at the keyboard. You want to know and sort of schedule it ahead of time. So setting this to false would be a good idea. And just like Zentetsu mentioned, you can also set up email and notifications with this, so you can get notified whenever a package is upgraded. Is there anyone that is using this currently, unattended upgrades? No? Okay, well, something to check out. Curious to see what people think of it. Fail to ban. This is another one I know a couple people in the community definitely use, and I'd recommend it. It does intrusion detection, and it can be set to, I think by default, it actually is configured to use or to monitor a lot of different intrusion detection scenarios. But SSH is probably the one we're most interested in. So the default setup is pretty good. You can install fail to ban, just sudo apt install fail to ban, and then check to see if it's running. You can also configure it to do email notifications, probably SMS as well. So whenever there's some IP that's banned, you could see automatically, hey, this person was trying to access my machine. Anyone currently using this tool? Give me one sec. Yes. Okay. Okay, looking through the messages here. Zantetsu added text belt in the chat. I'll make sure to save that text and put it in the notes for the video. And Brian gave a thumbs up for fail to ban, so that's awesome. All right. Sharing my screen again. All right, another thing that's useful is the firewall. Actually, let me double check. Okay, here we go. Firewall setup. Firewall, of course, it would be great if you have like a network appliance is actually a firewall that's before it ever hits your machine. But in the absence of that, or maybe in combination with that, it's a good idea to set up a firewall on your machine as well. UFW is a firewall tool that I've seen a lot of people use, but there are others as well. Excuse me. This is just a really basic setup of UFW, but of course there's other options. You can allow access, excuse me, dying over here. You can allow access for specific IPs. You can block IPs, lots of different options here. But another tool that I think useful to have and useful to set up.
Just curious, where'd you get 12,000 from?
Just a number I picked. It's
okay.
Not,
I mean, when I started, there were documents said 10,000, 8,000 to 10,000.
Okay.
And that's what I used. And I have no idea if those documents still exist or if they've been updated. I've read a lot of conflicting posts on Discord. Some people say, oh, you need to go to 9,000. Oh, you only need to go to the range that you set in your validator command line options or whatever. And I don't know what the right number is. 12,000 seems fine to me. I think people have had conflicts when they've tried to run other software on other ports. Now, why you're running any software in your validator that would open a port other than the validator and SSH, I do not know. That seems like a very bad idea. But but anyway, that range can be arbitrarily large, but I think needs to be at least like to 9,000 or 8,100. I don't know what the correct range is, to be honest.
There's a minimum number of ports. I think it was 20. So I think at the minimum you need 8,000 to 820 or whatever range, 9,000 to 920. But I think a lot of people open up more ports than that. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is just a preference. Maybe Brian, if you have more context there, what you set up there.
To be honest, I would have to go look. I don't recall off the top of my head. So
I think with Quick, you have to have at least like 1,000 or maybe even 2,000. I don't. The old days, maybe 20 ports was enough, but these days it has to be quite a bit more than that.
Okay.
Yeah, and we tend to follow the suggested documentation without too many customizations on ports or things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So this is what I set up, but again,
can I ask this person? Sergio said 20 in the chat. If that person is able to describe, do they really mean they only have 20 ports open on UDP and TCP and it really works even with Quick? That surprises me. It might be true.
Let me stop the share real quick. Yeah, so Sergi, how do you actually say your name, Serge? I just say Sergo because that's your handle.
Yeah, in general, Sergey,
Okay.
Sergey, but normal Sergo is fine because it's like combination of my name to name.
Great. Yeah, so I think 20 is what's documented. I don't know for sure if that's actually the minimum anymore with Quick, like you mentioned. Yeah,
I think the validator has that thing, but I think it's wrong. Like you can set that, but in fact it uses more than that. So I think there's some disconnect between the command line options and then value. Like I think that the actual runtime now Quick doesn't even obey that range. So yeah, it's a little bit confusing. And I think if you set it, I think the best thing is don't run anything on your validator that would ever open a port. And then you can open all the ports you want to. You know what I mean? Because
right.
open 8,000, 10,000, 8,000, 20,000 doesn't matter because at that point there's nothing that's going to open a port anyway. So you know you're really just opening a huge block for the validator. And I think personally that's what I do.
That's solid advice.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let me share again. Okay, so we've gone over this before in other validator workshops, but just to reiterate again, every validator that's a voting validator has 3 keys: the identity key, the vote account key, and the withdrawal key. The identity key is required to run the validator, and it pays fees typically, although you can have a different fee payer than the identity key if you prefer. I don't see a need for that for most cases. The vote account key, which is mainly create at one time, and then it doesn't really have a lot of value after that. It's just to identify what validator to stake to if you're a staker. And then, of course, the withdrawal key can withdraw funds. It can change the identity. It can change the withdrawer. This key is the one that you should keep very secure. It should never be on the server, obviously. Ideally, you want to make it a cold storage key, hardware wallet, something where you're very, very sure that no one has access to that but you. So I brought this up because the identity key is actually the thing that's been getting compromised in the recent hack and then in other messages that I received on Discord. And what came out of that, and I think Brian was the one that mentioned it, is that you don't actually have to even put your identity key on the machine if you don't want to. You could instead do what's in this next slide, which is to run the validator in sort of a non-voting mode, and then only put the key on the validator once the binary is running in memory. So it's only in memory. It's not on disk, which makes it more difficult for an attacker to get that key. Of course, the downside to this approach is that automatic restarts are broken. So if whatever happens, let's say the server shuts down for whatever reason, restarts, the restart won't work successfully, and you'll have to intervene manually to fix that issue. So if you have systemd set up and the restart happens, the restart won't go as planned. So that increases some operational overhead. But again, the win here is that you don't have to worry about the key getting compromised, or I shouldn't say don't have to worry about it, but it's less of an attack surface, right? The key doesn't stay on the file system. So if an attacker were to gain access to the file system, they wouldn't be able to get the key.
Yeah, and that's the biggest risk there. Also keeping in mind that most of us are running on rented bare metal. We occasionally give these servers back to the vendors. And if there's not proper security protocols in place for recycling a machine, you could end up with a situation where your key is still sitting there visible for the next user of that machine. So there's like stuff you just don't think about, but you know the risks are out there. So the Yeah, we're doing this now. It's a good trick. It is a little bit harder to manage, but it feels a hell of a lot safer than leaving JSON files on a disk.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to kind of back up a sec there, I wanted to make one point here. Oh, yeah. Another good practice that I sort of glossed over, didn't mention here, is that it's always a good idea, whether or not you store the key on the file system, to keep your funds small, right? So even if you're not storing on the file system, even if you run it in memory, you still don't want to have 10,000 SOL in the identity key, because there's no reason to have it sitting there, right? Keep it as small as you're comfortable with to pay voting fees and nothing else. So if, let's say you're getting enough rewards and sort of at an equilibrium where you can keep maybe 2 or 3 SOL in the identity key, that's a good practice instead of keeping a lot there. Yeah, so a little review of the process for setting this up. You want to start your validator using the no voting flag. So your validator is essentially functioning like an RPC in this case. And you want to as well start with a temporary identity key. So it could be any identity key you want, doesn't really matter. That identity key is going to get swapped out when the validator is up and running. And because the identity key should have no funds in it, it doesn't matter if you keep it on the server. So you keep that key on the file system, run the validator, and then when the validator is running, caught up, you can use the command Solana validator authorize voter add and copy and paste in the identity key array of bytes, or not bytes, but an array of numbers, essentially, the JSON contents into the standard input.
You don't have to wait till it's caught up or even close to catching up. It's probably right. The idea, you can just do it as soon as you start the validator. The point is that, you know, it's not on the file system, but it has to happen after the validator starts. And you probably want it to happen well before you catch up, because you don't want to miss votes because you didn't get it in time.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, as soon as it's ready to receive commands through the admin interface. Tim, the thing that we do is we start up in voting mode, but both the validator ID and the vote account ID are dummies. Okay. And so what it means is that there's no SOL in the ID wallet, so it can't actually vote. Like basically, it's ready, but it's broken. And there's a bunch of errors that get written to the log. We just kind of ignore those. And then when you go through, and then when you do the authorized voter and the set identity commands, then it just magically works at that point. And I'll try to just confirm what I just told you, just to make sure I'm not misleading you.
Okay, fair. Is there a reason why you set it up voting? Is that?
I think we just found it to be easier.
Okay.
And it might just be an operational thing too, that our configs were already set up that way, and we didn't want to bust configs for a bunch of machines. So. Yeah,
it makes sense. Okay, yeah, so figure out what's right for you. But again, the key takeaway here is that you use a dummy key, start running with that dummy key, and then once the validator process is started, you can switch out the voter sort of in memory without having it on disk. Yeah, that's all I got. Kind of wanted to keep it short today and end the presentation here. Open it up to questions and thoughts. I'm curious what the rest of you are doing and sort of where operationally and security-wise you've made trade-offs. Anybody want to go?
Well, I wrote a program to address some of my issues. And
yeah.
Yeah, that was my, my solution to some of the problem. But I do keep my, the solution I have does not remove the issues that Brian has found to address via the steps of setting the identity as the validator starts, because I do keep my validator key, info key, identity key on the node, and I just accept that if that thing gets hacked, that's my that's the only downside, is that I have to, you know, reset my identity to a different identity and my authorized voter or whatever. That's, you know, that's the risk I'm taking. But it makes operationally a lot simpler because I don't have to be there. I just have, although to be honest with you, it's in about the last year, it's never the validators really never restarted unattended. Before the last year, it used to sometimes crash, especially when I was using GPU enabled. It would crash occasionally. That hasn't happened in a long time. So I probably could accept, you know, having to be manually present for every restart. But I just haven't done that yet.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I think the bare minimum of having the identity on the machine and nothing else is super important, right? Like as long as you're doing that, you're 90% of the battle's won. If you keep the amount of funds in the identity small and you do or do not have the identity on the file system but no other keys, then you're most of the way there, or even 100% of the way there, depending on what your setup is. Yeah. What is the recommended way of restarting a validator with no to minimum downtime? Yeah, I'm curious, is anyone else, do they have a second backup there?
We have a hot backup, but I mean, I'll confess that we really only use that in the case of an emergency. If there's a actual problem on the primary machine, I mean, right now, if we're doing a software upgrade, to be honest, we'll just restart the node. And it seems like there's so much hassle with switching to the backup machine and then restarting and then switching back, especially for a relatively short period of time. So, but yeah, if there is a problem on the primary machine, then absolutely we're going to move, and then we'll just leave production on what used to be the backup server is now the primary server. And then this one is going to be the backup. So kind of a blue-green scenario, you know, where you're flopping back and forth.
So I have exactly the same situation as Brian Long. And I think that maybe this comes from when you started to be a validator and the tools that were available at that time and the techniques that were common. And we're kind of embedded in that. But I think that some new people coming along are doing the good work of finding a better way, since they haven't, you know, they're still getting into understanding how to run things. So they're finding the better ways to do things. And I think that having a hot failover is absolutely the best way to do it. My hot failover is in the same data center cabinet, so it's not as good as if it was in another data center. And so I really need to have one in another data center, but that becomes more costly and more complex by far. So it's a subject, it's like I see it in the distance, I just keep avoiding it and looking at other stuff. But yeah, it's a thing we should have.
Yeah. So none of you use the hot backup for upgrades then, if you're upgrading to a new version of the software? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I totally understand the reason why we should do it, but then there is the operational hassle is significant there. So
yeah. So Pumpkin says he upgrades all the time with hot swaps. Anything you want to add there? Is there sort of best practices that you figured out?
I love it if Pumpkin can. I don't know if the docs that are out there are sufficient, but I'd love it if he's having success with it. It would be great to have a really comprehensive and clear write-up with all of the rough edges described. That would be awesome.
Yeah. And a round of applause for Pumpkin.
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, I just kind of expanded upon the Michael Vine's identity transition demo. I'm basically doing exactly what he said, only I kind of simplified the process because the way he wrote it was kind of theoretical and it was kind of difficult to read. And because it was all on the same machine. But yeah, I mean, I could make a write-up of what I'm doing. It's actually not that complex to do at all. And I can share that.
Yeah, it's great if you would do that. I personally haven't broached the subject because I also want to come up with some strategy to have it happen automatically, like if my validator fails. But that gets really complicated because you don't want them both to think they're lead at the same time. You have a third system out there that's watching them both and making decisions and trying to coordinate. I was thinking of doing something like having each one just watch for votes landing and having a timeout where the leader says, well, if my votes haven't landed in 5 minutes, I'm just done. I'm never going to vote again until I see the backup, start voting, and then it goes down. Then I will start again. And maybe that would cover some cases and it wouldn't require a third piece of management, but it's so complicated that again, I keep not broaching it because it seems like a very big mountain to climb, and I keep trying to find the smaller hills I can get up in the meantime and not have to make
it's easy to get burned too, because if you hot swap, if you screw up your hot swap, you can trigger the duplicate instance check, and then both of your nodes are down. So I think I'm figuring out ways around that though.
Yeah, happy to coordinate with you if you've got, you know, even if you just kind of want to meet and describe what you're doing and have me write some stuff up, or find a community member that wants to write it up. It would be really valuable, I think, to share.
Yeah, definitely. Especially recently, I've had a lot of concerns, and kind of the issues that I did have. I had a chance to talk with Michael Vines about the different issues I encountered, and he kind of ironed those out. So I think I have a pretty good idea going forward of the gotchas that you could encounter.
This does intersect with security, because if you had a really good hot swap setup, then you could theoretically, if you got hacked on your main system yourself, independently of that system, set the identity to a new host and hot swap over to it or something like that. And then you could, like, you know, basically pinch that old one off completely. And you know, that's a security feature to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Resiliency.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? I've got to leave a little early today, so cutting it kind of short, but good discussion. I think I definitely want to follow up, Pumpkin, on that docs.
I'm going to put a link to my program. I know it hasn't been audited yet.
Yeah.
And no one really uses it, except I don't know if Pumpkin's still using it or not, but it works. I mean, I've been under it for, I don't know, a month or two now, and it works fine. So if you find what I'm doing valuable in terms of the ways that it lets you manage keys a little differently, feel free to use it and give me any feedback and you know, any help I can provide. I'd be happy to do it. Pumpkin pointed out that, you know, the command I wrote to do it, the client side of it, is not super well hardened. Like, it'll submit transactions, but if a transaction fails, it doesn't even tell you anything. So you kind of have to, you know, run the thing. If you're going to, like, actually run the program to make a change to your keys or something, you have to kind of go and look at the Explorer and see what the result of that transaction was, which, you know, so it's a little bit rough around the edges, but it is secure. That's not a security flaw. It's just that the tool is not as, you know, as foolproof as it could be, the client side of it. But anyway, I'll make a link to it in case anybody wants to talk about it or read about it.
Yeah, I dropped a link in the chat. Like you said, it hasn't been audited yet, but I think this is something that the foundation in general is supportive of, right? I think Santetsu, you talked to Labs team members, and they sort of said that they want to make this a composable feature rather than change the actual core software. And so, you know, this is what you came up with, and I think it's a good approach. So pending an audit, I think it's a good idea. It kind of eliminates that problem that I mentioned briefly earlier, that the withdraw key does a lot of things, right? And you don't want it to both be a withdraw and a authorized changer of identities and of withdraw keys. Cool. Any other thoughts, questions? All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'll have another one of these maybe in a couple weeks or a month, depending on interest and sort of what comes up. But like always, I want to plug that if you have a topic you want to cover, or if you want to lead one of these, that would be really, really awesome. I'm trying to make it so that I'm not the only one actually leading these. So please, please, please get in touch with me and we can schedule something. But otherwise, thanks everybody, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Tim. See ya.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.